Welcome to today's webinar, Controlling Weeds in Landscape Beds, brought to you by Landscape Management and our sponsor, SureGuard Herbicide by New Farm. I'm Joelle Harms from North Coast Media, digital producer for Landscape Management Magazine, and I will be your event manager. Before we get started, I want to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded. You are currently in a listen-only mode. The recording will be available 2 weeks from today on our website, landscapemanagement.net/webinars. A link to the on-demand recording will also be emailed to you when it is available. At this time, I'd like to acquaint you with the ways in which you can participate during today's presentation. Please notice the Submit button in the lower left-hand corner of your console. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Just type in the text box at the bottom left, then click Submit to place your question in queue. Questions that were submitted during registration may be covered in this webinar. Some questions may also be answered in an upcoming issue of Landscape Management Magazine or in our weekly e-newsletter, LM Direct. We strive to answer as many of your questions as possible. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties during today's event, select Help to submit your issue, and assistant producer Diane Safranek or I will personally assist you. Now I'd like to turn today's event over to our moderator, Landscape Management Editor-in-Chief Marisa Palmieri.
Thank you, Joelle, and welcome everyone to our 2014 series of Build Your Business webinars. Today's topic is landscape bed weed control, and we have two great speakers lined up to cover both the technical and operations side of this service area. Also, we have to thank our sponsor, New Farm and SureGuard Herbicide, for making today's webinar possible. On the technical side, we'll have Dr. Jeffrey Derr, Professor of Weed Science at Virginia Tech, talking about the technical side of this topic. He provides weed management information to commercial landscape maintenance firms and lawn care professionals and oversees the turfgrass evaluation program at the Hampton Roads Agricultural Research and Extension Center, among other research and extension duties at Virginia Tech. And on the operations side, we have longtime Brickman employee Joe Ketterer, who's a regional production specialist for Brickman. Joe's responsible for coaching production teams, conducting seasonal in-house training in the classroom and in the field, and performing research and development on the latest labor methods, materials, and equipment. He's also a certified pesticide applicator in ornamentals, turf, industrial weeds, and aquatics in Maryland and Virginia. So thank you both so much for participating today. We're really looking forward to hearing your presentations. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeffrey for his presentation.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. As mentioned, I'm Jeffrey Derr, a weed scientist with Virginia Tech, and I'll be talking about various ways, non-chemical and chemical ways of managing weeds, and a little bit of basic weed biology. One of the things that's important with weeds, just like insects and diseases, is to know specific weed species that you're dealing with. Once we know a particular problem weed species, then we can develop a control strategy, but until we know something about that weed, we really can't do too much on the control side. So what I've listed is just a few, and there's other books out there. Some of the weed identification books, I think it would be good to have one of these on the shelf. I've used extensively over the years Weeds of the Northeast. That's an excellent guide. We will see Weeds of Southern Turfgrass, Weeds of the South, Color Atlas of Turfgrass Weeds, more turfgrass and related weeds. Just keep in mind that in any given weed book, you may come across a weed in your operations that's not in the guide. We do have a lot of look-alike weed species. So it would be good to double-check perhaps a couple of sources just to verify a particular identification. But those are some suggestions on some books. Like I said, it would be good to have one on the shelf to help you in identifying weed problems. And something else that I have is there are a number of weed ID websites that are out there. I've just listed two that we maintain here at Virginia Tech. Obviously, other universities across the country will have weed ID websites. If you have an idea of what a particular weed might be, you can go to one of these websites, check it out, see if it matches up with the weed you're trying to manage in your operation. what I'd like to do is to start out with a definition of what is a weed. We have various definitions: plant out of place, undesired plant, plant growing where it's not wanted. But sometimes it can be difficult with the plants and nursery crops that we work with, that depending upon the situation, one person may consider it a desirable plant, and another person may consider it a weed species. So obviously as you're working with your clients, you'll need to identify what their desired plants are and which ones they're trying to get rid of. And as an example of that, there's a few species I have listed: purple loosestrife, prickly pear cactus, bamboo, English ivy. Some people, continue to plant these species. Others will think those are invasive species that need to be controlled. So again, depending upon the client situation, these may be considered weeds or desired plants. And kind of to further that issue, depending upon the state, we have different regulations as to what might be species that are banned. And I'm showing you just a few species. This is not a complete list, but the Massachusetts Prohibited Plant List has species that we are actually planting in Virginia. Our nurseries can grow plants like autumn olive and border privet, dwarf burning bush, Japanese barberry, Norway maple as an example. But these plants could not be sold, planted in the state of Massachusetts. So depending upon what state you're in, you may have some different restrictions than people in other states. I guess another issue along these lines is as you're putting in new species, keep an eye on them. They may not have been fully tested as their potential to be invasive. A number of our problem weed species are ones that we brought in, planted intentionally, and have escaped and become weed problems. There's several ways we can separate out, classify weed species, and one way is to do it through plant taxonomy. And I've just given you some of the major weed taxonomic groups here. And it's important to have an understanding of weeds and which species fall into which classes. For example, the monocots, mono meaning one, these are plants that have only one seed leaf when they germinate. So we have the grass family, with crabgrass being a good example. The sedge family, yellow nutsedge, being a major weed problem. We don't have many weeds in the rush family, but occasionally I do get calls about plants like pathrush. In the lily family, wild garlic, wild onion are important landscape problems. In the spiderwort family, Asiatic dayflower can be a very troublesome landscape weed problem. Those are all monocots. And then dicots, or broadleaf weeds, common ragweed as an example. And where this can become important is in terms of especially herbicide selection, that we'll have herbicides, for example, that will control grasses and not sedges. And where that can be a problem is, at least in our state, people often use the term yellow nutgrass. It does resemble a grass, but it's a sedge. We have to use a sedge herbicide and not a grass herbicide. So misidentification can cause you to apply the wrong product and not see control of that particular problem. So we want to have an understanding of these groups and see where the weeds that you're dealing with, where do they fall. So that's one way to separate plants, is on a taxonomic basis. We need to know that. But we also need to know something about the life cycle of the species that we're trying to control. So we have three categories: annuals, biennials, perennials. Annuals live for only one growing season. They have to come from seed. Biennials live for 2 years. They also come strictly from seed. And then perennials live for many years, and they may spread by seed. They may spread vegetatively by rhizomes, tubers, etc. So as a group, the perennials are hardest to control. Annuals tend to be easier to control. Within the annuals, we can divide those up into two broad categories: summer annuals and winter annuals. We're at that point where, with these warmer temperatures, our summer annuals will be starting to germinate. But if you look out in landscapes now, mostly what you'll see is winter annuals. And you say, well, why is it important to know the difference? Well, in some cases, we may use the same product to control a summer annual and a winter annual. The difference will be application timing. We may put down a product for a summer annual like crabgrass now in, say, March or April. We may use that same product in August for annual bluegrass control, which is a winter annual grass. So again, have an understanding of when these weeds start to germinate, realizing that some species will somewhat overlap these two categories. And within these groups in summer annuals, we have grasses like crabgrass, broadleaf weeds like common ragweed. Occasionally we'll run across annual sedges. Our major problem, though, is the perennial sedge, yellow nutsedge. Have some other monocots that we need to keep an eye on, as well as some winter annual grasses and broadleaf weeds. And I'll give you some examples. Biennials, we only have a few biennial weed problems. They're all broadleaves. In landscape beds, we can do fairly well in controlling perennial grasses. Perennial sedges like yellow nutsedge, more of a challenge, and then other monocots, wild garlic, can be very difficult to manage. And then our toughest group is our perennial broadleaf weeds. So this has a few pictures. You're probably all familiar with some of our summer annual grasses, large crabgrass, giant foxtail, goosegrass, or weeds that will be starting to germinate very soon, depending upon which part of the country you're in. Winter annual grasses, one very common landscape weed is annual bluegrass. It'll be flowering very soon, depending on which part of the country you're in. Number of annual broadleaf weeds that we're faced with, both summer and winter annuals. Lamb's quarters, pigweed, ragweed, morning glory, spurge. Spurge is a major landscape weed. Again, these will be germinating soon. Winter weeds, vetch, horseweed, fleabane, chickweed, henbit are flowering or will be flowering very soon. It's easy to identify the winter annuals now when they're in bloom, and then we'll identify the summer annuals, especially in late summer, early fall. May not be the time to control them, but it's a good time to identify them. So again, some common annual broadleaves, ragweed, and spurge. And some common winter annual broadleaves, again, flowering around now, vetch, henbit, common chickweed, and horseweed. And they'll be starting to germinate generally around first, second week of September through the fall. As I mentioned, we only have a few biennial weeds: musk thistle, wild carrot. Now we get into our perennial weeds. We have clump-type perennials like fescue and orchard grass that don't spread very quickly. The harder the control group is our creeping perennials: blackgrass, Bermuda grass, Johnson grass. We'll talk a little bit about yellow nutsedge, and we've mentioned wild garlic as a perennial monocot. We can also separate our perennial grasses into the cool season grasses, which are green, growing right now, like tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass. The warm season grasses in our area have not greened up yet. Weeds like Bermuda grass or Dallas grass, Johnson grass, nimmerwill, but will be greening up once we get into consistently warm weather. So we'll control the warm season grasses at different times than our cool season grasses. And then yellow nutsedge, we want to identify that. It'll have a triangular stem, shiny three-ranked leaves, and we see it growing best in wet sites and in full sun. Again, I mentioned wild garlic is a perennial monocot. It can be a very difficult to control weed. And in perennial broadleaves, we can separate these into simple perennials that only spread by seed, dandelion, and buckhorn plantain. And in the much harder to control group are creepers, bindweed, brambles, poison ivy, horse nettle, hemp dogbane. I'm sure you're all familiar with dandelions and buckhorn plantain. And examples of creeping perennials: poison ivy, horse nettle, hedge bindweed. Hemp dogbane, very troublesome perennial weed, and we even get tree species that can be a problem, like black locust, mulberry trees, if they can get into a landscape site. Okay, in terms of how do we manage these weeds, we have some cultural options, and then we'll talk briefly about chemical control for these different species. We want to minimize hand weeding. That's expensive, time-consuming, difficult during the summertime. We can do tilling in some places, hand hoeing, I'll make some comments about organic mulches like pine bark or pine straw. Inorganic mulches would be rock mulches. We've worked with those. And we'll, in some cases, improve weed control by using black plastic or landscape fabric. So just some general guidelines in using organic mulches. We want to aim for a 2 to 4 inch depth. If we have existing mulch, we don't want to be piling deep layers of mulch on top of old mulch. Use a good quality mulch if it has an off odor like a rotten egg, a sulfur, ammonia odor that can actually damage landscape plants. Again, use high quality mulch that's free of weed seed. Mulches tend to do fairly well controlling annual weeds. In my trials, rock mulches will do better than bark mulches. Bark mulches, as they break down, can support weed growth. And we've worked with a variety of organic mulches, pine bark nuggets, straw, etc. And we've worked with a variety of rock mulches, white marble, volcanic rock materials. They all have places. You may not want to be putting rock mulches where you're going to be running lawnmowers, but we do see better weed control with rock mulches. And if you're going to use a rock mulch, I'd suggest putting a landscape fabric underneath it to separate rock mulch from the soil below. One of the problems with mulches in general is we'll see perennial weeds come through. And here we have Bermuda grass and yellow nutsedge coming through this rock mulch. Black plastic can be used to improve weed control, but it lacks porosity. So the best fit we feel is in annual bedding plants and in vegetable gardens, but not in long-term use in woody ornamental beds. Problem with black plastic, again, it lacks porosity, can have water going through the material, can't get good gas exchange, doesn't hold mulch well. I think you've seen this where the mulch shifts above black plastic and it exposes the fabric, an appearance problem. You can see where water won't pass through these materials. We researched landscape fabrics, and they do allow for water and gas exchange, but the ones that, in general, the straight landscape fabrics give us lower weed control than solid black plastic. Weed shoots can penetrate upward through the fabric. Probably the bigger issue is weeds germinating in the mulch layer and sending the roots down through. So we want to keep those fabrics totally covered, and again, if you can use it, a rock mulch will do better. And we've worked with a variety of woven and non-woven landscape fabrics for use in landscape beds. And another alternative is using pre- and post-emergence herbicides for weed management in beds. In terms of application timing in general, now is the time, late winter, early spring, for our summer annual weeds. If we have a very wet spring or early summer, these herbicides will break down, and we may need a second application at that time, and then I'll say a late August application for winter annuals. But we can't put down a pre-emergence herbicide any time of year as long as the ground's not frozen, there's no snow in the ground. We just need to control emerged weeds through hand weeding or other methods. And we do need irrigation or rain, ideally soon after an application of a pre-emergence herbicide. And herbicide selection will be based on the nursery crops in the area. Here's a guideline for annual flower beds, site prep to control perennial weeds prior to planting. There might be something like a glyphosate application. Wait a week, rototill that site, transplant our bedding plants, irrigate to settle the soil. I recommend a granular herbicide such as a trifluralin or pendimethalin product. Irrigate to activate the herbicide, and then put your mulch on top. We get into perennials and woody ornamentals. We do have a little wider selection of pre-emergence herbicides. And in general, with most of the products we have, we want to apply them prior to mulching. We see better control than applying them after mulching. So as an example, if you have a mixed bed, hostas, daylilies, junipers, azaleas, hollies, other woody ornamentals, granular options include snapshot and freehand. Freehand would be a benefit if you're trying to suppress yellow nutsedge. sprays, Gallery is our major broadleaf herbicide, and you want to mix it with a grass herbicide such as the Surfland Barricade Pendulum, or if you have yellow nutsedge, Pennant, Magnum, or Tower to suppress yellow nutsedge. We have into strictly woody ornamental beds. We have even greater selection. We can use the previously named products, or we have products like Broadstar SureGuard, which is same active ingredient, flumioxazin. Broadstar is the granular form. SureGuard is the spray. Broad spectrum annual broadleaf and grass control. There are other combination products such as Roundup that combine a broadleaf herbicide and a grass herbicide. And Casseron, probably our most active herbicide for landscape beds, but there are some special timings, winter applications, and other specialized uses for Casseron. And then we have a few options for post-emergence weed control in landscape beds. We can control grassy weeds selectively. Several choices here: Segment, Fusilier, which is also sold as Ornamec, Envoy, and Acclaim Extra will selectively control grasses. For yellow nutsedge and woody ornamental beds, we can use directed sprays of Sedgehammer. We have a new registration for Dismiss. Bazagran is another material that could be used. Again, these are directed sprays, keeping it off the woody ornamentals. And we are very limited in terms of products for broadleaf weeds. We do have Lawn Trail for certain woody ornamentals, but not a very long list. Otherwise, we have to be very careful with our non-selectives for perennial broadleaf control. So the non-selective herbicides, we're going to be more careful with these. We have some contact materials that won't affect the root system of perennial weeds, such as Reward, Scythe, acetic acid-based products. Finale is a contact herbicide with some systemic action. And our overall most effective material on perennial weeds is glyphosate, which is sold as Roundup and a number of other trade names. Since we're using a lot of glyphosate for perennial, especially perennial broadleaf control, again, there's many producers because it's off patent. It's leaf and bark absorbed, so we want to keep it off the bark of young trees or trees with thin bark. It is inactivated upon contact with soil. Apply it when we have weeds growing under good soil moisture, warm temperatures. And to get greater safety to avoid systemic injury to our desired plants, consider using a wiper application or a shielded spray when you're spraying near desired trees and shrubs. Yellow nutsedge, again, we want to go after that pre-emergence with something like Pennant, Magnum, Freehand, or Tower. And then post-emergence-wise in woody beds, again, we have things like Sedgehammer and a few other products to control yellow nutsedge. I haven't mentioned all the products that are available. You can check with your local cooperative extension service and check herbicide labels for specific use rates, precautions, etc. And thank you for the invitation. I hope this information is beneficial to you in your operation.
Thank you, Jeffrey. We really appreciate all the great information. And if you have questions for Dr. Derr, you can type them into the question box, and we'll field them at the end. And that goes for Joe Ketterer too. So we'll field your questions at the end. And with that, we'll turn it over to Joe for his part of the presentation focusing on the operations side.
Thank you, Marisa. Thank you, Jeff. I always learn something new from Jeff, no matter how many times I get the pleasure of hearing him. I will try to focus now on the operations side. So with that being said, the goal, wait a minute, what? The goal, click back to something else, I'm sorry. Here we go. The goal of this talk for me is to improve the appearance of the landscape beds and increase the ornamental plant health through management of weeds. I have some ideas to use some of the chemicals that Jeff has taught me about and that I have learned about over the last 30 years. And we'll get into that. I'm struggling with the advancing here. Here we go. All right. From a safety standpoint, first of all, safety is first and foremost. We need to review the common PPE that is necessary during the product application and particularly during the mixing operations where most of your exposure to the concentrate will occur. I want to talk about the importance of certification and being licensed or registered to have registered technicians, and understanding why following product labels is so essential. And then most of you have probably tuned in to find out about the tools and equipment, some of the things that I've learned through the years to help with the application, to do it accurately. On the safety, personal protective equipment, you see pictures there, the spill containment. I'm not trying to advocate any one vendor or anything like that, but it's important to have all these things. We are required to wear safety vests at all times, safety glasses at all times, gloves at all times. Now, the gloves that we're required to wear during the workday are not the same gloves that you'll need during the spray applications. You need the nitrile type gloves. One of the things that is particularly a concern of mine is the importance to have a clean eye wash bottle in the event that you do get any material in your eyes. So you got to have that on board with the truck. As far as product handling goes, we are required, being a large national company, we have to have a business license for every location we have. In my area of Maryland and Virginia, there are 19 branch locations. They all need to have a business license and have certified applicators along with registered technicians. Cannot stress the importance of reading the entire product label. I always tell my people forward and backwards. You got to be able to read backwards and understand it, and make sure that we're doing everything possible, because these products that Jeff mentioned earlier all have their place. They all work. They wouldn't have gotten licensed, I believe, if they didn't work. What makes them not work is our inability to follow directions and apply them properly. Okay? So, in addition to reading the label, the calibration, I think, is probably the single greatest challenge we have as an industry to make these products. And some of the smaller companies will say that stuff's too expensive, or that stuff costs too much, I can't afford to pay that much for these herbicides. And I say that all we're trying to do is have a weed-free appearance, and if you take the time to apply the products properly, you can reduce your dependency on hand pooling of labor. So I have to constantly sell my own managers on the idea that you got to spend money to save money. So with that in mind, the calibration piece of it is so critically important, and we'll talk some more about that, because you got to do it right if you're going to get the results that you're after. There's other things like cleaning up of any spills. We're going to talk about some ways to prevent that. To properly store and secure the products. You can see in the pictures some of our branch locations use the Sealand type containers where we've bought them outright. We've had to have them ventilated. We've had to have them heated so the products don't go through any freeze or thaw cycles. You got to protect your investment. You got to protect the people and the environment. I suppose it could go without saying that remove and clean your clothing after handling, and wash your hands thoroughly after handling the products. As far as tools and equipment go, we use a number of different tools. These are just a handful of some of the ones that we have grown to use more than others. Some of you may be familiar with the Acme Spred-Rite. It used to be called the Diclomec spreader back in the day. And that little thing hasn't changed at all in probably the last 30 years that I've been here. I have gone and made some changes to it. You can see in the upper right photo, instead of a green plastic paddle, I've had them paddles custom made out of aluminum so that they don't crack and they last long. I've replaced the clear plastic tube with CPVC piping, so on and so forth. The unit, when you buy them, I think they're around $18, $20. They're so simple, yet they're fragile. So I've had to try to make ours bulletproof for commercial use. Another specialty type product for the piece of equipment for the granular application is a backpack blower. I don't know, most people know the backpack blower to clean up things and not to actually disperse granules, but we have been running the steel for some time. They're not cheap, and they're quite fickle, if you will. You want to designate those blowers to the applicator and not try to get other utility out of them by using them with the mowing crew or a leaf cleanup crew, because the more you use them, the more they get banged around, and they need to be protected. But when they do run and you take care of them, they can cover some ground in a hurry and lay down a real nice even application of granular materials. And we found this to be particularly successful when you're dealing with steep slopes and it's hard to walk on the beds. And you can actually blow. You see from the picture, the guy's blowing it from the sidewalk, blowing up, and then at the top of the bed he can blow down without disturbing the mulch that you just laid down. In that case, that was broad star going down over the top of the mulch. Most pre-emergence, I believe, Jeff will back me up on this, will need to go down prior to mulching. In that case, we were blowing broad star on top of mulch. And then another type of thing is the handheld sprayers, the backpack sprayers, and there are a slew of specialty ATV type sprayers. You see us doing a lot of curb and crack work with the ATV sprayers when you're doing a larger volume on larger sites. Some additional tools that you'll need, and I'll go back to that calibration idea. One of the questions that we had posed to us was about snapshot, and maybe you're struggling with having it work as well for you as you might like for the money that you spend. In my experience, and we have used snapshot for years and years and years, probably the last 25, and I don't think the problem is with the chemical itself. If you can tell by those pictures, those are pictures that I took on actual jobs where it's being over-applied, under-applied, and every year we go through it again and again and again. You know, big doesn't necessarily make you better. It can make it more challenging if you don't have the proper training in place to have as few people possible that really know and understand what they're doing. And you see us using the calibration trays there. Typically, we like to go out at the maximum rate, but Jeff was talking about in flower beds, if any of you plant fall pansies or violas, you know the danger of chickweed and henbit can overrun your beds. If you don't use some type of pre-emerge, you could run into some trouble with the need for hand weeding. When you do use pre-emergence in flower beds, you really got to pay attention to calibration, and we'll cut our snapshot rate in half down to 100 pounds per acre, as opposed to what the guys are used to applying at 200 pounds. So very important to use those calibration trays that the manufacturer and the distributors will be happy to provide you with. The Spred-Rites have the ability to apply different granules, but you can't use the same calibration tray for different products. These calibration trays are very specific to the product manufacturer. In this case, there's a black tray there that is made specifically for Broadstar, and I've had, even in within my own company here, people thinking they could use the snapshot tray for calibrating for Broadstar, and it doesn't work that way because of the differences in the bulk density and the volume of that the granules occupy. I want to also emphasize again on the calibration thing when it comes to liquid applications. These are some of the tools I use in the field when I'm trying to teach the applicators how to determine how much volume they're putting out, how much volume of finished spray. And you can see the marking tape. You don't want to go around painting up your clients' parking lots, depending on where you're at. I'd like to do a lot of that in our own parking lots. So in the lower right there, you see where I use pink duct tape to make a little 10 by 10 box so we could determine how much volume of spray they're putting on a 10 by 10 area, and then I multiply it by 10 to determine the volume on 1,000 square feet. Because most of your material rates are given in per acre or per 1,000 square feet, and you have to know how much water you're pumping out on that known area before you can even begin to think about how much material to put in the tank. We talked about calibration trays. On the tip and pours in the lower left of that slide, we have to properly label these tip and pours. And I don't like to depend on the Sharpies anymore. I've found these weatherproof stick-on labels that you can type up, because typically we got to make dozens of them. And that's what you see in the lower left. And there's all different sizes of tip and pours, but we're required to have certain information in the state of Maryland and Virginia on those labels, and that's what you see there. In the center, we got the Acme Spred-Rite inside a 5-gallon bucket as spill containment, and then we're pouring the snapshot in through an actual little traffic cone. That was actually my daughter's little cone from her soccer days. It turned out to be a nice funnel to try to keep all the product flowing freely, because it's very difficult to pour the material out of a bag into one of those Acme Spred-Rites. And then the last picture is with regard to SureGuard and the need to check those containers and actually weigh the product out. It's very important that people understand the difference between dry ounces and liquid ounces. And the good people at New Farm, formerly Avalent, have given me quite the lesson in the importance of weighing product out to be accurate. I've had people use that particular container that you see on the digital scale measure things like Roundup with it because they see ounces. That container was made specifically for measuring SureGuard. And it says it right on the container, but people get in a hurry and they see something that looks like it's a measuring cylinder. And when you put Roundup in that is a liquid measure, into a dry measure like that, you're going to be grossly over-applying the product. So very important to understand the difference between liquid and dry measures. Okay, in this slide I was emphasizing the importance of storage and transportation. Both of these pictures I took of our trucks, of our ops managers, and the one on the left is organized, but it's not compliant. It's not compliant because some of the products they're not in a lockable container. So I went to, I believe, Walmart. You can find those containers that you can put things in and lock it up. That's really important. It also keeps things, it's waterproof, so it keeps things nice and dry. You may notice in front of the 2x4 there are 4 or 5 gallon bottles of water. That's sometimes how we carry water in the field, so we don't have to go around searching for a spigot that works to fill up the backpacks. The thing I want to caution you on is that you should label those jugs non-potable water, so no one gets the bright idea that that's the water truck on a hot sunny day and that they can just take water right out of those containers. Very, very important. With the granular products, we talked about label. I wanted to point out in the lower pictures there about the PPE required when filling the Acme Spred-Rites containers. We like to have multiple containers so we can do all our filling with the full protective gear. You'll notice my counterpart, Jamie Sharp, I believe that is, wearing a dust mask and the glasses and the gloves, because some of the products can be dusty and you don't want to be inhaling the dust. And your maximum exposure to the product is usually during this filling procedure. It's typically not when you're actually applying the product. So I just wanted to make note of that there. In Virginia and Maryland, even when you're spraying just Roundup, it's important to have long sleeves on. Long sleeves, I believe, is part of the label. We debated that for years and got some clarity. And the gentleman on the left there is dressed the way I would like all of our guys to be dressed. There are, as far as some tips and techniques go, I still can default to some of the premix type products. This is one made by Ortho that I am quite partial of. It does a great job on poison ivy, and it comes in this premix container with a little handheld pump sprayer, and you can spot spray. In this case, I was spot spraying poison ivy growing through knockout roses. It didn't hurt the roses. I believe it was Turflawn. It's like a very low rate of Turflawn, but apparently poison ivy does not like that chemical very much at all, and it does a great job for you, and it's nice, handy, well labeled, very easy to use. One of the things I learned along the way is the importance of drift control, and I have listened to Jeff speak a number of times and some of his counterparts, and he mentioned earlier about glyphosate around the base of young trees, because most people need to understand that glyphosate will kill literally almost anything it comes in contact with. Does a great job on grasses, but you've got to be cognizant of the drift. And that's that fine spray that can blow. Even when you think you didn't spray it directly, it actually is in a mist and it kind of moves laterally. I made this drift protector, and you can buy them for $7-8 a piece, or I can make one out of one of the sport drink bottles in probably under 2 minutes. But it has to be done properly. And it's a great tool for us to be able to use in delicate work where the mulch meets the turf, so you don't do damage to the turf. And when you're up tight to the base of shrubs and trees, to keep the Roundup on the target weed and not on the desirable plant material. Okay, another helpful technique is the use of a wick applicator. And what you see being done here is it almost looks like a hockey stick with a paint roller on the end, and you fill the tube or the handle with like a 50-50 mixture of Roundup and water, and you can wipe it on. And what's going on here is there is honeysuckle that has invaded a euonymus coloratus bed, but you can't even see the euonymus because it's buried by the honeysuckle. You can't pull the honeysuckle, you'll just aggravate it. So what we're doing is we're wiping on Roundup and trying to selectively take the honeysuckle out of the euonymus without getting any of the Roundup on the euonymus. It's a pretty cool little tool, comes in handy. I mentioned earlier about the pouring the bag material into a 5-gallon bucket, and those 5-gallon buckets, that particular one is from our athletic field marking paint containers. We're just recycling them, and we're taking the lid off, pouring the granular product into the bucket. These are a great idea, especially when you're working on days where it could get a rain shower or something like that, and there's nothing worse than a wet bag of material. The only thing that's wrong with this picture is that we need to now label that 5-gallon bucket with one of those weatherproof stickers to say what's in that container. And I purposely put that in there to remind you that these are those little details that need to be taken care of, because if we were to get inspected by the Department of Agriculture, that would be a violation. Jeff mentioned a number of books. I cannot stress the importance of the weed ID thing. The first step in choosing control is to identify that weed and understanding of its life cycle. There's the perennial weeds, biennial weeds, winter and summer annuals that he went through. The picture on the right is one of our account managers plucking out Canadian thistle out of, I believe it's St. John's wort. And he's just doing that for the immediate effect because they were so large that I didn't want to treat the large weed and have a big dead dying weed. So we pinched them off, and then we're going to let them leaf out a little bit, and then we were going to hit them with Lontrell, which does a very good job for us. Takes out the Canadian thistle, but instead of having this giant, ugly, big dead dying weed, we were just trying to reduce the negative impact of the unsightliness of it all. So as I wrap things up here, I cannot stress my wife is a principal in an elementary school, and she's still telling me at 54 years of age to make good choices. So when it comes to selecting and applying pre-emergence herbicides, you have many choices. We use a lot of different products, some for particular reasons. Jeff mentioned freehand on its ability to help with nutsedge, which has seemingly become worse and worse and worse. Casseron is, for an old product, it still has a place. Snapshot is a great product, and as is flumioxazin, and I believe the one product I'm missing here is a relatively new chemistry in Spectacle or in Dazaflam. Not cheap, but it's new chemistry and apparently is being highly touted. So it's a never-ending challenge to keep up with new things and attend the seminars. I've attended I don't know how many LCA local seminars and have heard and had the pleasure to listen to Jeff and some other speakers, and I'm always learning. So thanks for tuning in today, and I appreciate your time. Hopefully it was of some help to you.
Great. Thank you, Joe. And now it's time for some questions. So I'm going to go through these, and I'll direct them to either Jeffrey or Joe. The first one is one of the pre-submitted questions. And Joe, since you were just speaking about application topics, I thought I'd ask you, if using a backpack for application, what's the best nozzle for the job for SureGuard?
That's a very specific question that somebody is asking. And I appreciate that because I have gone to great lengths to eliminate variation. So the nozzle is one of the areas of variation. If you buy a backpack sprayer, typically you get a cone nozzle that you adjust by screwing it in or out, and it'll go either wider or down to a pencil stream. The problem with that is it's not so bad with spraying Roundup, but when you're using a product like SureGuard that is not a cheap product, and you're using it at these low rates, you got to be dialed in really, really well. So I have gone to answer this question. I have gone to mandating a flat fan nozzle that is a fixed amount of volume that can only come out of that tip. Because if you don't do that, you'll get variation because different people think that it requires different amounts, and you'll have people hosing things down with the pencil stream, and then you'll have people, trying to walk a country mile on a gallon of a mix if you use the real fine misting thing, and then you have problems with drift. So the answer to the question is you're on the right track, whoever asked the question. I would get a fixed nozzle. I prefer a flat fan T-Jet 8005 for whatever that's worth to you.
Okay. Specific question, specific answer, so that's helpful. Joe talked a little bit about a new product called Spectacle at the end of his presentation, and we have a question about that directed to Jeffrey. Do you have any comments on the use of Spectacle in landscape beds?
Yes, we have looked at Spectacle for weed control. It's a fairly broad spectrum annual weed management. We have both a spray and a granular formulation available. Best fit is in woody ornamentals. We cannot apply Spectacle to annual flower beds, to bedding plants, and a number of perennials can be injured by Spectacle. But it does have long residual action. Its strength is annual grass control, crabgrass, goosegrass, annual bluegrass. And it will do well on a number of annual broadleaf weeds like spurge, for example, and very good on bittercress. So I didn't have time in my presentation to have all possible herbicides, but Spectacle is one that can be used especially in woody ornamental beds with long residual. And another advantage of Spectacle, it has a different mode of action than the other herbicides that we will use in landscape beds. So it's a good rotation material. We are concerned about development of resistance in weed species, so good material to use and to rotate with in regard to some of the other broadleaf herbicides that we have for landscape beds.
Okay, great. And Jeff, here's a pretty general question for you. That was a pre-submitted one. What's the best, or is liquid pre-emergent or granule pre-emergent best for mulched beds?
That's a good question. I would say just in general, there'll be some exceptions, but in general we have greater safety with granular herbicides. So I would tend to lean towards granules, but as Joe mentioned, calibration is really critical that we get that material out. And that's, I think, a greater challenge with granular formulations is getting it evenly distributed. Both granular and liquid herbicides will work. The key is with both is accurate calibration. The advantage of granules is that they will fall through the canopy of our desired nursery crops. So that's why, in general, we see a little bit greater safety with our granules. If you look at certain products, and Broadstar and SureGuard would be an example. With Broadstar being a granule, we can use it on more species than we could, say, a liquid spray. So both can work. Both have their places. Calibration being important, especially for the granular formulations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another very specific question for Joe about, hopefully I'm saying this chemical name correctly, Casseron.
Yes.
The question is, Casseron 4G is an aromatic particle like mothballs. How do you handle watering in? How safe is it to apply over the top in woody beds infested with grasses and broadleaf weeds?
Very good question. It is an old product, but a goodie. Okay, and it is, when they said aromatic, I think they meant volatile. meaning that the granules can actually take in moisture out of the air. Like, you do not want to be applying this product on an 80, 85 degree day when it's hazy, hot, and humid, because the granules can volatilize, meaning that the chemical can be released as a gas into the air and can drift. And it's the gas that's drifting, and then the leaves that are breathing can take in that gas, and you can do some damage. So first rule is never apply Casseron in hot weather. It works best in a fall or winter application or early spring. Like right now in our area, I wouldn't hesitate to be out there today with it. Okay? And you put it down at the right rate. Ideally, you cover it up with mulch. But if you cannot cover it up with mulch, you would like to get it watered in before the temperatures get to a certain, like, I'm guessing 75, 80 degrees is the threshold. It is activated at 60 degrees. So watering in is a good thing. Hopefully you have the ability to do that manually. If not, you got to hope for some light rain. And I want to emphasize light rain, because if you put Casseron down on a slope like I did 35 years ago when I worked while in school in Pittsburgh, I had to replace about 5 pallets of sod at the bottom of the hill because we had a thunderstorm and the Casseron granule was literally picked up and floated down into the turf and then settled into the turf and then killed the turf. So you got to really know, and the reason I'm not afraid of it is you learn from your mistakes. And it's still a great product, but it can move on you. So you got to be careful with its use on slopes. You don't ever want to put it on wet foliage like a ground cover and have the granules stick to that foliage, because you're going to do some burn. So it comes with a lot of caveats, but if you know how to use it, you can control Canadian thistle and you can control Bermuda grass in ornamental beds and ground covers. You got to be really sensitive to all these precautions.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more. Jeffrey, here's one for you. Is there a spray to control perennial grasses in ground cover beds of juniper, ivy, euonymus, Lirioburvinca?
Yes, we have several selective post-emergence grass herbicides that could be used in a number of ground covers, junipers, liriope, etc. Envoy is one that fits well into that use. Segment fits well, and then Fusilade also sold as Ornamec. All three will control perennial grasses and will control annual grasses. We want to treat annual grasses when they're small. Perennial grasses, when they resume growth in the spring. We need actively growing weeds. These are products that are mainly absorbed through leaves. And for troublesome perennial grasses like Bermuda grass, Johnson grass, we generally need repeat applications to totally kill what's underground. Even though these materials are systemic, we never completely kill the underground rhizome system with one application. So if we can treat, come back in 3 or 4 weeks and retreat any regrowth that occurs, but we can selectively control a number of grasses with the products that I mentioned in ground covers, woody ornamental beds. The major concern with those post-emergence grass herbicides, keep them off of turf areas, keep them away from ornamental grasses. But otherwise, we do have selective options for post-emergence grass control.
Okay, great. And then here's one for you, Jeff. I know you touched on using hose and other tools a little bit in your presentation. One of our questions was about using scuffle hose for quick cleanups and then laying a bed pre-emergent. Is that doing more harm than good by only scraping off the top layer of the weed and not getting to the root?
the question, when we're hoeing an annual weed, we want to just cut that weed at the soil surface. We don't want to be bringing up a lot of soil from deeper in the soil profile, because that's going to be bringing up weed seed. So for a weed like, say, common ragweed, we don't have to dig out the roots. We just have to cut that stem at the soil line, and it won't come back. Now, if we do have perennial weeds at the site, most of them will come back from their rootstock or rhizomes, so we may have to do repeated hoeing to control those weeds. But we want to try to minimize soil disturbance so we're not bringing new weed seed that can germinate. So if we can control those weeds in that have germinated in the top inch or two and not do much soil disturbance, we'll have much less weed germination later on in the growing season.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we are right at 2 o'clock, or a little after 2 o'clock, so we are going to wrap up here. Thank you, everybody, for hanging on here. We appreciate it, and we appreciate your listening, and thanks very much to Joe and Jeffrey. And Joelle just has a few closing comments for us.
Thanks, Marisa. Thank you, everyone, for attending the Controlling Weeds in Landscape Beds webinar presented by Landscape Management and our sponsor, New Farm. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the Landscape Management website and will be emailed to you 2 weeks from today. Please visit the Landscape Management website for future events like this one. Thank you for attending and have a nice afternoon.